You are of the opinion that we've likely seen Tua in his final game at Alabama. If in fact that's the case, in the pantheon of Alabama greats, and I know it takes some time to consider this, and there's high emotions and everything that go along with a situation like this, and understandably so. Where does Tua sort of stack up if this is the last we've seen of him as a Alabama player, Cecil?
Those questions are difficult, Travis. Here's the first one you have to consider. What time frame are you talking? Are you talking 100 years? Are you talking since the first team? Don Hutson was a Wilt Chamberlain figure. He changed the game, changed the way the game was played. So he's got to be in any pantheon. The other thing about Don Hutson was at the end of his career, the beginning of mine, I asked Coach Bryant once who the best player he ever coached was, and he wouldn't give it. He gave an answer about so many great players you couldn't say who, and he wouldn't rank them. So I changed the question up a little bit, and I asked him who the best player he ever saw was, and he said Don Hutson's the best player ever walked across the football field. So that carried some weight with him. Now that conversation was 37 years ago, but Coach Bryant had seen some players, and there was no close number two to Don Hutson. So you have to include him if you were talking about the whole history, although I certainly never saw him. There's probably maybe a handful of people left who did, but not very many when they were kids, but not very many. So then you get to Namath, who was certainly charismatic, and went on to pro greatness, but was a great college player whose career was also affected by injury, and particularly by the medical procedures that they had at the time. Things were different for Joe, but is such an iconic figure. Then there are three guys who may be the best who ever played their position. You can debate this. John Hanna, that offensive guard. Derek Thomas as an edge rusher, maybe the best ever in football. Dwight Stevenson as a center. So you mentioned those guys. Kenny Stabler, another super athlete and super charismatic guy. So I think all those players would have to be considered. And then think about that I hadn't yet said Ozzie Newsome. I hadn't yet said Julio Jones, who's probably the best receiver in the game today.
Two Heisman Trophy winners are still out there.
Two Heisman Trophy winners. But
I'm with you. I mean, your list is resonating.
Tua is in that group. If you have to narrow it down to four, for me, and you've got listeners who call in and say, I wouldn't have any, other than Tua, I wouldn't have any of the other three. For me, because every position is important, I would probably say, and I'm not a Mount Rushmore guy, but
it's tired. But I hear you.
Let's just use four as a number. I would say Hudson, Hanna, Derek Thomas, Tua Tagovailoa.
Wow, that's a hell of a foursome to play around a golf with.
I'm 100% aware of Leroy Jordan, of
Cornelius
Derrick
Bennett,
Henry, of Cornelius Bennett, who's a friend of mine, of Johnny Musso, of Pat Trammell. But that would be my four because they were probably arguably the best ever to play their position, not just at Alabama, but anywhere. And I know Tua, I don't know that ultimately in history, partly because his career has had the injuries. Yeah, I don't know that people will put Tua with, and some of it, so much with quarterbacks gets tangled up with their pro success. Peyton Manning was a great college quarterback who also had pro success. Elway was a great, though not particularly good record on the field. The Stanford teams he played for weren't great. Favre at Southern Miss, I saw him. You might have seen him, but people don't think of Brett Favre at Southern Miss. So where Tua will come in as a college quarterback, just his college career, it'll be interesting to see. It's going to be an interesting situation for Tua in 10 years, 20 years, when he comes up to the College Football Hall of Fame. Because I think he certainly belongs there. Absolutely. If he never plays another down of college football, he's accomplished enough to be in the Hall of Fame.